This is Mae Brussell. It is tape number 858, May the 16th, 1988. Move over Adolf Hitler. We're getting ready for Henry Kissinger. It seems that his PR people wanted him photographed with his dog. Dog Tyler had cancer. He took it to the National Cancer Institute, and the vet came. Another one came from Wisconsin to help him. The dog died. But there was a description of Kissinger and a picture of him with Tyler, and the vet said he was talking to him totally flat out on the floor, just telling Tyler how much he loved him. And it reminded me of the extensive effort that Adolf Hitler made to be photographed with his dogs and with a lot of children around him. So I think Kissinger is the manipulator behind all the news that's taking place now, and he very quietly pats his dog, the late Tyler, and gets a description of a loving, caring person as other events come crashing down on a lot of people's heads. The little newspaper on the newsstand, The Star, which has such outrageous stories, has one inside, didn't make the headlines, but we'll see more of this later. It has to do with Larry Hagman's co-star who's moving onto the sets of Dallas. It's none other than Alessandra Mussolini. I believe she is the granddaughter of Benito Mussolini, the niece of Sophia Loren, and she is coming to make movies for Lorimar Productions. Remember, a good hunk of that is owned by Mo Dalitz of the Mafia, the man who lived and worked closely with Robert Mayhew of the Assassination teams under the guise of the youth organization. So soon we will see on our television Alessandra Mussolini, and the beat goes on. These people don't even bother to change their name. As a matter of fact, they're very proud of it. The television and the radio talk shows have been filled with information that is pertinent to material I've had on the program for years, and some of this I will update with you. Some there will not be time to cover, but we're simply inundated with stories, and some are new slants, some are the old slants, but the material keeps pouring out. I will do a segment in a week or two about Manchurian Candidate. Frank Sinatra was on Larry King's show for an hour. It was an interesting interview for what he left out, and I'll do some more about that. The movie is coming here to Carmel next week. I haven't seen it for a long, long time. It's owned by Frank Sinatra, so I'll see it and then share that with you. Also, we're Phil Donahue and Larry King had Don Reagan on, and he gave some revealing glimpses of himself as much as he did of the White House, and we'll do more about him, the former chairman of Merrill Lynch, and I've done quite a few broadcasts on Don Reagan and the Mafia money deposited through his empire that went to Switzerland and funded Paul Waradell, and that money went to Bakir Salink, and I'll update a lot more on Don Reagan. I have that book also, but he doesn't put his past into the book. This is just about Nancy, to get even with Nancy, for he thinks she's the sole person who wanted him fired. There have been quite a few television programs, spot newses on the new evidence that came out with the Robert Kennedy assassination. Not new evidence, it's been locked up for 20 years, and the parts that were available that would prove a conspiracy are missing from what they've released, so the controversy beats on about that matter, and the Kennedy children have been on television quite a bit, Robert Kennedy's children, and of course the subject of assassination is never brought up. There was a 30-minute segment on TV on the murder of Marilyn Monroe. The only thing new about that was the suggestion that she could be killed by the Mafia in order to embarrass the Kennedys, rather than killed by the Kennedys to protect their politics. So that slant was interesting, and I did mention before the half-hour segment on Vicki Morgan and two attorneys saying that her murder was a political murder to protect people high up in the administration. This coming not from the National Enquirer, but from attorneys involved in the case. And then Frontline this week is having Leslie Coburn's Out of Control, and the headlines that I'll be going into in a few minutes, again, have to do with George Bush, the CIA, and the drug connections. So this is getting more open and getting national attention on a program such as Frontline. Geraldo Rivera has had a segment with Charles Manson and Mrs. Tate. It wasn't particularly good, but it does bring up the Manson story again. And Anthony Simpson has been interviewed quite a bit for his book, Blowback, How Nazi Criminals Came to the United States. I also have that book. I'll get out a sheet maybe for you next week on books that I have obtained in the last month. There are so many of them, and there won't be time to set aside for each book to discuss it, but the pertinent thing for me is to share with you the parts left out of the book. So what's there, you can see the parts they left out is always the main story. And, of course, there's been 2 big segments on national TV news on INSLAW, the corporation that was forced into bankruptcy by the Justice Department, and there is going to be an investigation into the perjury angles of how the Justice Department forced a judge and a person working for them to perjure themselves on the stand. So that has gone into the investigative stage out of the magazine newspaper barons and into possibly the courts, which would be interesting. And David Chime has been on quite a bit of television. His book, it was reprinted. It came out 2 years ago, Contract on America, the Mafia Murder of President John Kennedy, has been the reason for his interviews. They've been very tough on him on television, and Mary Tillison on CNN and on Crossfire, Robert Novak and Tom Braden, and their feathers really get up when you talk about political assassinations and Robert Kennedy. And, of course, Scheim is no spokesman for the persons wanting to know who killed Kennedy. His book is all about the Mafia. He has 2 pages that just simply mention General Walker, and one is that Jack Ruby said that his activities and his concerns go back to General Walker and the John Birch Society. That's where a good book, I guess I'll have to write the good book on the Kennedy assassination, takes off, as I did for Rebel with my article on the Nazi connections, and go into the right-wing angle. We've heard enough of the Mafia role already. And, of course, they make good patsies. And in David Chime's book, the second reference to General Walker is the ad wanted for treason that was paid for an associate of General Walker's. It was a full-page ad the day that John Kennedy came to Dallas. But, of course, left out of this book is the testimony of Bernard Weissman, who said they used my name because they wanted a Jewish name. And he doesn't, of course, even connect the General Walker Hotel at Berchtesgaden or the Munich people that came into the Dallas area. It's all the Mafia, and, of course, they make great scapegoats. Now, regarding the INSLAW situation, that corporation that was forced into bankruptcy, I have done 2 broadcasts, and I'm going to do more on it. There have been some very good articles out, and a listener to World Watchers has gone to the library and got me the ones that I didn't have. He found some current ones. I'll give you the dates quickly in case you want to look them up. INSLAW judge points at 2 smoking guns. This is Washington Post, June 10th, 1987. INSLAW wins ruling against the Justice Department. Washington Post, June 13th, 1987. Justice Department is held in contempt in bankruptcy. New York Times, June 14th. These are all 1987. Judge charges Justice Department drove the firm to bankruptcy. Washington Post, September 29th, 1987. Judge slaps the Justice Department. September 29th, 1987. U.S. Judge Basin is taken off the INSLAW case. Washington Post, October 6, 1987. Also, there was a long article that was sent to me by the same person. It's titled Flash Reports on FNN, Financial News Network. And it was printed in Barron's February 28th, 1988. And by the same person who wrote the article that I've been sharing with you and sending to you on INSLAW. And the author is Maggie Mahar. Now, I'm going to do at great length the bulk of this article with you and continue the other part. But just for brevity today, I would just want to bring up one point that is in this article and get back to it later. FNN, Financial News Network, is owned by Dr. Bryan. He also owns 40% of the Infotechnology. That's another information newsletter. And in February 1988, they bought up United Press International. Now, in describing the FNN Financial News Network, Maggie Mahar quotes the people involved with the financing and how they happen to have enough money to buy UPI. And the story is that the sudden scoop of FNN, that's the Financial News Network of Dr. Earl Bryan and his friends, came because of the October 1987 stock market crash. And this is a quotation from the article from Barron's. It's a story FNN was born to cover, the stock market crash in October of last year. This is our version of the Kennedy assassination. Now, many of you might have read that article, some of you didn't see it at all, but they referred to the fact that they had a scoop on the stock market crash that gave them enough money after October to then buy UPI, United Press International. Well, what did they mean by their version of the Kennedy assassination? The quotation was from FNN's news director, Eve I can't pronounce her name, Krzyzanowski, Krzyzanowski. And they said this Eve Krzyzanowski, will shorten it there, crowed that this was their version of the Kennedy assassination. Now, when I saw that, I immediately thought of several items that I'm going to share with you. On the day of the John Kennedy assassination, described in the book Were We Controlled, and I've had that on the program going years back. For you long listeners, you will remember it. The book Were We Controlled, The Assassination of President Kennedy. It was written by Lincoln Lawrence, and what the gist of this book was that certain persons had foreknowledge that John Kennedy was going to be murdered November 22nd, 1963. And specifically, they named the Bunge Corporation, B-U-N-G-E Corporation, from Germany and Argentina. And they also had offices in New Jersey. And they made a profit of $500 million November 22nd, 1963, because it was involved the commodities market, but they sold it when it was high, just before Kennedy went through the streets of Dallas, and sold it early that morning. And according to this book, they knew what they were doing because the market dropped as soon as John Kennedy was killed, and they had cleaned away at a high price $500 million. Now, just last month, April 23rd, 1988, there was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle. 1987 stock market crash, this is the October crash, is linked to the Japanese. And this isn't just a nobody making the research or the investigation. Somebody very high up, Nicholas F. Brady, was chairman of the investigative committee on the crash. He's chairman or officer of Dillon Reed, and he also led the panel investigating the crash. And he also has been named to be the Secretary of Treasury if George Bush is president, and he is also a Knight of Malta with George Bush, the two of them, and they're also both members of the Skull and Crossbones, which has nothing to do with the article. But the article says 1987 October crash linked to the Japanese. And it continues, the head of a presidential panel investigating the October stock market crash said an enormous sell-off of U.S. Treasury bonds by Japanese investors incited the plunge. And they referred to an article in Wall Street Journal, April 22nd, 1988. The Federal Reserve had to inject more than $10 billion into the U.S. financial system in the days following the crash, according to Nicholas F. Brady, co-chairman of Dillon Reed. And the real trigger, he said, was the Japanese came in for their own reasons and sold an enormous amount of government bonds and drove the bonds up 10%. Now, I think of the Trilateral Commission with David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger on the board, and also Gerald Ford is on the board of the Trilateral. And the two active members who are outdoing us financially out of the Trilateral are Germany and Japan. And if people had foreknowledge that Japan was suddenly going to trigger, for what they said their own reasons, this tremendous amount of altering of our stock market, and they've been fingered as being a part of it, then a hunk of that profit went to Dr. Earl Bryan, who's very much in the news with the INSLAW case. He tries to separate himself from it, but it was that money that allowed him, that man never really accrued a huge fortune, to buy the United Press International. And his press secretary from the company said, it is a story that Financial News Network was born to cover. This is our version of the Kennedy assassination. Also, there was a newsletter that came out this past month. It comes out monthly, called Monitor. And the April issue is on the Klan and Nazis in the United States. And the gist of this recent issue was about the October 9th, 1987 stock market crash. And they said that the gist of the story was they hoped that this crash that would be something that they could turn the crisis to their advantage. The domestic Nazis and the Klan in the United States, that people will be fearful of those of Asian descent, and they identified the Japanese. This monitor came out before the conclusions that Japan triggered off our stock market crash but they hope that the distinction between Japanese, Oriental, and then Jews and blacks would help their whites-only America, and that the very strong Nazi Klan groups in the United States are working with the stock market, with the financial empire, as I mentioned on a program not too long ago, with the AT&T affair, and they're hoping that these crashes and a depression will trigger sentiments against minorities who are taking jobs from whites and would give them the edge. So that is a long article that I will go into more from Barron's, February 28th, but I think the mention of the success of Dr. Earl Bryan buying UPI was based upon the stock market crash, and knowing his contacts with people close to the financial empire. Who else benefited by the crash at that time? We know a little bit about who lost, but not who benefited. Another long article, February 28th, the same Barron's magazine, it's a weekly magazine, like a newspaper, but weekly. It's called Bryan's Meese Connections. That's Dr. Bryan's connections with Meese, and it goes into the companies, Biotech, Questech, their friend Edwin Thomas. It's a long article, and again, I'll do that with you and go over that material because that's the material that I had on World Watchers in 1984 when Meese was nominated to become the Attorney General. Then there were there's another long article in Barron's, March 21st. Scientists and stock pushers make very strange bedfellows. And this is a long article about INSLAW and Dr. Earl Bryan. Now, stock pushers, the money people and the scientists, do make strange bedfellows, but it is indeed an industry. The medical profession is an industry like U.S. Steel or automobile or whatever. And it was the late Howard Hughes who said, keep the Hughes Medical Institute, medicine is the fourth largest industry in the United States. And to have a doctor, a neurosurgeon who for all purposes only practiced 2 years in Vietnam and then went into these kinds of experiments in laboratory and news media and cancer research, etc., portends a lot of dangerous things that come to my mind. Then there were two long articles this week that may have been the reason that Edwin Meese's press representative, Mr. Eastland, just resigned. One is titled Justice Probing Computer Firm Case. Department officials are being investigated for possible perjury. This is Washington Post, June the 6th, 1988, by Elizabeth Tucker, spelling out more trouble for Edwin Meese and going into the fact that one judge in the INSLAW case was fired, Judge George Basin, that Mr. Hamilton's attorney Lee Ratner was kicked out of his law office, that Anthony Pizzuto, the executive from the Justice Department, was fired. Things that I've brought up in regarding the INSLAW case, and I'll get back to, but another long article from the Kansas City Times, the same date, written by a different person, James Rowley, Associated Press. Perjury investigation is looking at Meese's Justice Department. Now, the only difference between some of these headlines is injecting the name Meese in there, but as I say, the national television is making note that there is going to be an investigation of Senate committees into the INSLAW case, and I'll do more on that later, but there are a couple of other stories I want to do now and then get back to INSLAW. A very important person in terms of my research passed away this past week, and I have to spend a few moments about him because he was such a big influence in the way I studied the Warren Commission hearings, and that was Kim Philby, the double agent from British intelligence who ended up working for Soviet intelligence. San Jose Mercury, May 12th, has a long article, Double Agent, Philby Dies, Betrayal by Third Man Shook Britain to Its Roots. And the New York Times and most of the newspapers had stories of Kim Philby and his life and his father, Harry St. John Bridger Philby. He was a British colonel, an author, and the story of Kim Philby is quite open, and I don't have to go into too many details. He was very close to people in Germany just before Hitler came into power. In fact, married, fell in love with a Jewish woman, and then he realized that the Western powers were not going to be able to stop Adolf Hitler. So he went over to Spain and covered the Spanish Civil War for the London Times and for the New York Times, with the intention then of really becoming an agent and finding out about fascism as it existed in the Western world. And he saw many of his friends die, and he was accused of being this far right-winger, and he couldn't blow his cover. And he worked his way up to be just about top of British intelligence, and his two co-workers fled to the Soviet Union ahead of him, two that he worked with who were high up, actually, in Washington, D.C. Mr. Burgess was one of them, and McLean, and then he had to flee to Moscow, and he just died. Now, I made a study of Kim Philby's books when I was reading the Warren Commission hearings, because I never had training in studying espionage. I'd never read a spy book, never saw a spy movie. So I obtained all the books on Kim Philby I could get, and the ones that I had came out in 1968 and 67. I got The Third Man. These books are available, just to tell you, in case you want to go to libraries and get them or use bookstores. The Third Man by E.H. Cookeridge, the man who wrote Galen's Spy of the Century. The Philby Conspiracy by Bruce Page, David Leitch, and Philip Knightley. That was the first one, actually, I read. The Fourth Man by Andrew Boyle, the definitive account of Kim Philby, Burgess, and McLean. Then The Philby Affair by none other than you, Trevor Roper, who wrote the introduction to Mark Lane's book, and also he is the author of the book on the death of Adolf Hitler that I believe he lied about and rushed to judgment. At the time he did the introduction to that, I didn't understand you, Trevor Roper, and hadn't studied him either. Then there's another book, The Missing McLeans by Jeffrey Hoare, and Kim Philby, The Spy I Married by Eleanor Philby, which was very revealing to me to understand Marina Oswald if they were both spies. And then, of course, My Silent War by Kim Philby. So you can see I've read each of these and studied them, that I became somewhat of an authority on Philby. And what did I learn from him that helped me with my research in terms of understanding spies? There were three main things that I can recall, forgetting the incidences of special facts. One is how agents meet. He would describe, or these books would describe, and particularly his own, that he would be sent to a certain place like Istanbul, and he would take up residence there, and he would explain how he would meet other spies in the network. And he would be invited to a dinner party, and I've mentioned this on other programs before, I believe, and then another guest would be there. You'd have a host, and two people that didn't know each other. The host would be the source of introduction. You could meet that other person as a result of the dinner party and then see them one more time and not see them again. And both could be major spies in a particular operation. In other words, you didn't have to see each other continuously. And this was useful when I was studying Lee and Marina Oswald, when a person had a dinner party and invited Michael and Ruth Payne to the party. Anna Muller and George de Mohrenschildt was at the party, and he met the Oswalds at that party too. Well, the Mohrenschildts didn't have to, they brought the Oswalds to the party and introduced them to Payne. Then de Mohrenschildt doesn't have to see the Paynes anymore. He can flip off from there. He has made his introduction, and the Paynes then can take care of Marina and Lee, and then de Mohrenschildt can fade away. He doesn't have to see them again after April 1963. He can go down to Haiti and just disappear, and it's the dinner party which is the excuse for their meetings, and then the control officer takes over from there. Another thing I learned was the use of relatives in espionage, because Kim Philby would go to the home of his aunt, and he'd mention her name, and he'd see his aunt and uncle. Well, aunt and uncle weren't relatives at all. Those were just names that were taken onto them, and then it was perfectly all right to tell people, I'm going to my aunt and uncle's home this evening, and they weren't relatives. They were both agents and maybe not related to each other, not even married, but playing the married role. And as I studied the Warren Commission hearings, there was a big section, or big to me, not so gigantic that anyone ever quotes it, but a selection of letters that Marina Oswald was writing to Lee when after she met him, and she married and went to a resort, a small beach resort, and she would write to him letters about an aunt and uncle, and in the testimony of her relatives, those names didn't appear. And they were in a package of material they had in the garage that the Warren Commission got a hold of, or that they brought home from the Soviet Union. And then when they were living in the Dallas area, there were letters being sent to them from somebody in Fort Worth, and they had left the Fort Worth area, and they referred to the aunt and uncle of Lee and Marina, and they used the identical names that were used when Marina wrote to Lee in the Soviet Union. And they took the same aunt and uncle in Fort Worth correspondence that only went to Dallas, which is 20 or 30 miles, that was used in the Soviet Union. And this was they were code names for special packages to the Power and Light Company, to Anna Mahler, and to the espionage network that was actually very tight in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, but looked loose. And again, I'm going to have to write about that. And also I learned that marriages are not necessarily marriages. Two people can live together. They even have children together. And when the agency says, move on, you're going to take on a new person, or Kim Philby could leave his wife and 4 children, go to the Soviet Union, you simply split. These are arrangements. They're not marriages, even though you say I do and have all the proper ceremonies, but you give the semblance in a neighborhood of being married. This was depicted in the movie The Borgia Stick, how 2 people come home in the suburbs and open the door, and then when they get inside, they're both spies, and the only thing they have in common is the espionage work they do. So I was interested in Philby all the time, that he was alive, and read his books, and I do think it helped me in understanding, because this is not fiction. A lot of the fiction is based on the real world, but this is the real Kim Philby, and this is the way British intelligence works. And then, of course, William Stevenson of British intelligence came over this country and took over and helped form the OSS, and then the CIA, and he lives down in Jamaica, Tyrol Bay. He's alive today. So the stories that Philby had to tell have a lot of intricate details that prove that these things do happen in this way. And so when you see them in the news or read them in accounts of assassinations and so forth, you can relate to, yes, this has been done before. Yes, this is what Philby said. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way because it happened in Philby's life, but it is a clue that the possibility exists that these parties or social gatherings, or you see somebody one time, are all that you need to set up a major spy network from country to country, to just introduce one important person to another and then fade away. Now, there was an article in the Washington Post by Richard Cohn, sort of an editorial, May the 6th, titled, "Why is George Bush being so belligerent?" And the gist of this article, or opinion page, is that Bush has things on the candidate who would run against him, and that he's already threatening them, that he has ammunition. And being former director of the CIA, you can believe he has. And Richard Cohn said, people who know Bush say nice things about him, and all that I know is the public Bush strikes me as weird. Take Bush's recent response to a question from the press about legal troubles of the Reagan administration. Rather than answer the question, he put up his dukes, and he said in quotes, "We will have some fun, too, trying to look at what is going on in Illinois or Massachusetts, depending on which one wins a Democratic nomination. You know, we have cannon fodder if you want to get into that." Later, Bush says, "I hear them Democrats talking about it, but there's plenty of evidence, you know, to kind of go into a guilt by association mode where we can find corruption in Massachusetts, politics or campaign stuff or things of that nature. I hope we don't have to do it." And Richard Cohn says, writes a couple of questions. What language is the man speaking? A guilt by association mode? Cannon fodder? Ammunition? Who talks this way? Who boasts of being willing to play dirty tricks to engage by guilt by association if the mode should strike him? And he refers to him as appearing as a cowardly lion, but using words that indicate that he'll pull out some dirty stuff or guilt by association as soon as the candidate is selected by the Democratic Party, and he can get into the cannon fodder that he has and into that mode, which Mr. Richard Cohn found interesting. We'll take 1 second to turn over the other side of this tape, and then I will continue some more and then get into George Bush, the Contras, and the drug running, the stories that are in the news right now. This is Mae Brussell. It is side 2 of tape 858, May the 16th, 1988. I was going to continue with the bulk of the INSLAW articles today, but there were 2 articles in the morning paper that were so important that I felt I really wanted to share those with you right away. One is titled White House Aides Linked to Contra Arms Drug Deal, and the other one is White House Oversight of CIA. Book tells Casey ploy during Iran-Contra affair. Now, those are two separate subjects. I'll break them down, but they are very, very important. And the new book that's coming out, we'll have a continuation of books, as I said before, is one called Revolution by Martin Anderson, published by Harcourt Brace Jovanovich. But before I get into those two articles, and a few more if I have time, I want to repeat once more my premise that I've briefly referred to on different programs and may reiterate it over and over if the evidence keeps supporting it. And this is that there is a palace coup that took place as of the time when Eugene Hassenfuss landed. That I believe there was a coup, and I haven't done 1 hour on that and the role of Kissinger and Alexander Haig and Mr. Eagleburger and so forth, but I will get into that maybe and dedicate 1 hour on the other side of who is doing it. But when Hassenfuss landed in Nicaragua, I believed that he was an agent provocateur, that there possibly was a bomb on that plane that was set off, that Hassenfuss, we know, had his own homemade parachute, and that 3 others died. As soon as Hassenfuss was discovered or rescued, whatever you want to call it, he started to name George Bush, Donald Gregg, and the CIA agent Mr. Gomez-Rodriguez. The number 4 man on the plane, there were 4 there, 3 died. The 4th one has never, ever been identified yet, and I believe there still is a big story. It's over a year and a half almost since this happened, and the 4th passenger has never been identified. Now, I believe George Bush will win the election. It doesn't matter what the evidence comes out. I believe the election process is rigged with the computers, and there is no time between now and election time. We're going into June soon, in November, to investigate what George Bush was up to and his role in all of these matters. The information can keep pouring out. We have an identical situation to the Watergate hotel entry. Took place in June 72. Material was pouring out of Nixon's involvement. He was reelected in November, not 62, 72. He was reelected in November 72. However, he caught on, got Spyro Agnew kicked out and removed quickly out of place, and then the process of impeachment, and instead of being impeached, he resigned, but he was out of the way. Now, I believe presidents are selected, and I've said this before, 20 years in advance, and the important question now is who will George Bush have as vice president? Not George Bush or Dukakis, but vice president. And, of course, there should be a change in the Constitution that the election should be held up, not be held every 4 years in November. If one of the candidates, or both, one, is involved in matters that could be criminal, that could lead to an impeachment, put the election off until March and proceed with the investigation, use all energy and sources you can, hear all the possible witnesses, and, if necessary, have a campaign again and put it off instead of going through this process. Now, George Bush was fingered by Eugene Hassenfuss the moment he landed, which is not very much in the tradition of espionage. He didn't have to do it, and I believe that the escalation of the material in the television shows now is to keep putting George Bush down, because it doesn't matter. It won't help Dukakis at all, because Dukakis isn't even using it as a campaign issue. He's still talking about jobs or getting Noriega out. He isn't on to any of the real problems. So he's just a appendage of something, sort of like McGovern was in 1972. Now, the first article that I want to refer to from the San Francisco Chronicle, and this was on the Wire Services, May 16th, White House oversight of the CIA was reduced. This title says, Book Tells Casey Ploy During Iran-Contra. The headline is confusing. What the article is about is that the late William Casey maneuvered to weaken the White House oversight of foreign intelligence operations. As I say, the book is written by Martin Anderson, called Revolution. He was a former aide to President Reagan. He was chief of domestic policy during the first term. In fact, Barbara Honegger came to Washington under Martin Anderson and worked for him at the Justice Department. Anderson became a member of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Of course, on the board was Roy Cohns, who died of AIDS, Claire Luce, and Anne Armstrong, a very important member of that group, because she's also part of the policy group with Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger and Fred Eakley that has determined the policy for the next 20 years beyond the current policies. She was part of that, and I talked about in December of 87. Now, the premise in this book is that William Casey maneuvered purposely to weaken the responsibility or the knowledge that the White House would have, the White House oversight on intelligence operations, that Casey didn't want an oversight of intelligence operations. And Don Reagan, the former chief of staff, who's in the news so much, helped William Casey in the moves. He felt uneasy about it, but he did it. Now, starting November 1985, according to this book out by Martin Anderson, the President's Foreign Intelligence Board started to be revised. November 85, what happened in the year before that all of a sudden it's revised. Henry Kissinger was invited to be a member of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board after the Korean airline went down. He also was put in charge of Central America. And what they wanted was to get the White House to not have so much influence through this board that the CIA or the secret team would be doing things by themselves. So Henry Kissinger was given the Central American policy, taken over from the late Henry Jackson, Senator Henry Jackson, who died the day after the KAL crash. The board had 21 members originally. They reduced it to 14, and then 11 were fired, and then 4 more were added. And the purpose of all the shifting, according to Martin Anderson, was to put in celebrity people, famous people. They were too busy to check on William Casey. The controls were going on of the intelligence community, and he suggests that if the board were working, they wouldn't have gone into the Iran-Contra mess, because if Reagan had consulted with them about the diversions, etc., Reagan says he doesn't know about the diversions, but all evidence seems to appear that they all knew what was going on, the money for the Contras, etc. Martin Anderson suggests that by weakening the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, it not only left the president more vulnerable, but then the intelligence agencies could do what they want. And I believe a person like Henry Kissinger doesn't mind the president being vulnerable any more than he minded Richard Nixon being vulnerable, because he comes in as the elder statesman on all the television, radio, and gets the media coverage as being so squeaky clean all the time. Now, when the name secret team is applied to these operations, a code name that has become very popular because of Danny Sheehan's suit, think of what this book is saying. It's saying that the intelligence community, a handful of people, actually worked, we know, outside the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense, Mr. Weinberger, wasn't included in a lot of what they were doing. They worked out the CIA. They used some former agents and some currently in the CIA, but not as a CIA operation. They worked outside the White House, this enterprise, making the advisory board weak so that the president wouldn't get input of everything that's happening. They worked out of the State Department, making George Shultz not aware of many things that were happening. Certainly they were outside of Congress. They lied to Congress when questioned and didn't blush about that. The enterprise, this group, have their own Swiss banks, ships, planes, foreign contacts, foreign money, operations, countries such as Brunei, Israel, Saudi Arabia, etc., and the group of the enterprise, Hakeem Secord, Shackley Kleins, Willard Zucker, and so forth, are nothing but, to me, a combination of what I call the Odessa network. The secret team is nothing but the Odessa network, taking operations from the whole United States out of the hands of these various agencies. Now, Ann Armstrong made the initial complaint about the large number of people on the board, and Martin Anderson said Casey didn't like the old board size. He graciously allowed Mrs. Armstrong to be his stalking horse. She reduced the number of people on the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and Robert McFarlane, the NSC advisor, strongly supported Casey and Armstrong. And of course, McFarlane is a protege of Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger, and he took over McFarlane, the National Security Council, as advisor with Fritz Kramer and Sven Kramer sitting there. And McFarlane's aide, according to this new book, Kenneth de Graffenried, wrote a letter on reorganizing the board, and de Graffenried is the person in the White House that assisted Fawn Hall and Oliver North in destroying the papers that would have probably linked that back to all their machinations. And a letter was sent to President Reagan for him to consider this. It bypassed Don Regan at the front desk. So Ronald Reagan called Reagan and says, why are you firing all these people? and he was caught by surprise because they didn't tell him. They sent it right to the president's desk. So he called in Anne Armstrong, a woman who sits with Brzezinski and Kissinger, as I said, making policies for our next 20 years. And she said the board was too large and unwieldy. So actually, by reducing the amount of people, it gives those persons such as Henry Kissinger more power, too. By getting off the board, maybe people that would be opposed to Kissinger Associates literally running the State Department, as Henry Gonzalez said. So Don Reagan, according to this account, felt uneasy. He didn't want the responsibility, so he had a meeting set up between Anne Armstrong and President Reagan, and November the 4th, 1985, the firings were announced, and then that provided the security for the Iran-Contra affair with Casey and the National Security Council and the NSA and the agents they wanted, because those opponents probably that didn't like what would be happening were kicked off the board, and they had control of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Now, in this other long story that will be in the news for weeks to come and won't fade away, a UPI story, White House aides linked to Contra arms drug deal. Now, this has been the hypothesis of the Christic Institute, the basis of their suit. It's in Newsweek this week, and there's certain key points I want to share with you about this story and the drug running and the links to Honduras, and also the character who comes into this story, a very interesting person from the Central Intelligence Agency named Richard Brenneke. He's going to be making an affidavit with the Christic Institute this week, and the Brenneke who's mentioned in this article, who was in Washington giving testimony to Senator John Kerry, also worked with Paul Cutter, alias, his real name is Paul Sjeklocha, and Richard Secord and John Singlaub and Robert McFarlane, and of course this connection to the arms to Iran as well as the arms to Central America is very important. But these stories are breaking now, and they will flood the market as the Sheehan Institute suit goes on and hopefully goes to court, and as the private committees out of the Senate investigate, and certainly Lawrence Walsh isn't going to any of these matters at all. This article says that White House officials brokered the weapons sales to the Contras using an arms dealership that was tied to the drug trafficking, the Medellin cartel in Colombia. Based upon John Kerry's hearings published in Newsweek, the operations involved agents of the Mossad, the Israeli spies, top Honduran military intelligence, and the CIA-connected arms dealers. And you can see with the ties to Honduras so thick why Ollie North and Nestor Sanchez from the Defense Department were trying desperately to get a Honduran official out of jail, even though he was holding $10 million worth of cocaine money and was going to kill the former president, or the president of Honduras, rather. And I did a broadcast on that. The article says there is evidence that Donald Gregg, the NSC advisor to Vice President Bush, acted as a Washington point man in the operation. Now, we know that Gregg did. It's been out for a long time. The material has flooded the printed newspapers, and I'm going to cite one article in Progressive Magazine on the Bush connections that details every date that Don Gregg met with Mr. Rodriguez and George Bush met with Rodriguez. But the important thing, it is coming out now at this time. The Honduran-based weapons dealership is known as Arms Supermarket. It was the principal source of weapons for the Contras from 1984 to 85, when Congress banned all U.S. aid to the rebels. Oliver North from the National Security Council dealt with the arms supermarket. A report was prepared for Oliver North by an arms broker in 1986, warning at the disclosure of covert black money flowing into Honduras, where the Contras were based, could damage George Bush. And I don't believe that Ronald Reagan wants to damage Bush as much as, say, Nixon wanted to damage Spiro Agnew. And I believe that someone else, and I would really name Kissinger Associates as being interested in this, that there were warnings in 1986 that if you continue, you damage George Bush. North's notebook has an entry September the 10th, 1986, where he records a meeting of Donald Gregg, that's the National Security Advisor to George Bush, with Colonel James Steele, the U.S. military commander in El Salvador, and a key figure in the arms network in the three discussed weapons for the Contras, and Mario Del Amica, a former CIA officer brought senior Honduran military officers into the arms supermarket as patrons. Now, this is September 1986, and it's in October 86 when Hassenfuss not only lands, but begins to name Gregg and Bush and Rodriguez as quickly as he lands, and they already had the warning that this would involve George Bush. This was 1 month before the plane crash, where Hassenfuss has his own parachute, and the others, unknowingly or not even having one on, didn't live. Oliver North, according to the latest account, who Jerry Falwell calls the freedom fighter and should be pardoned, dealt extensively with all the principals in the arms shipment. He continued to deal with them even after he learned the weapons were purchased from proceeds of drug trafficking, drugs sent into the United States and Miami to wipe out a good hunk of our population with the drug matters. He continued to use it. The arms supermarket was carried on by 2 CIA gun dealers, and their names have been in the news before, Ronald Martin and James McCoy. And by mid-1985, the arms supermarket had a warehouse in a Honduran city with $20 million of East Bloc weapons. They loved to buy the Russian weapons, and then when they're found behind, they could say, see, the Russians armed the Sandinistas. It's really interesting, the route that these people took to get weapons from the Eastern Bloc, from Czechoslovakia to Yugoslavia, and how they ended up $20 million worth in the Honduras. The Reagan administration requested this operation, and when it was started, it was joined by the Mossad. The people in the Reagan administration wanted Israelis, the Mossad, to help them. They used their agency, and they wanted Honduran military officers involved in drug trafficking, and the CIA-connected arms dealers would work together. Now, I believe that Secord and these characters using the Mossad is similar to General Walker using Bernard Weissman. The Mossad has access to a lot of weapons, and they began supplying in Central America and in Iran weapons that they took from the PLO in Lebanon after the 1982 invasion. Now, Richard Brenneke is the character that's involved in this story. The arms dealer, he participated in these operations. The Mossad asked him to be a purchasing agent, and he brokered the East Bloc weapons in Czechoslovakia. He was very good at getting weapons from Czechoslovakia. Now, Brenneke is the same person who worked on the Demiven project of United States Arms for Iran and worked with Paul Sjeklocha out of Santa Clara. And he joined the USIA, which is like the CIA. This is Brenneke. In 1964, he was a tour guide in the Soviet Union. And the Sjeklocha and Brenneke were pals. Oh, I think that Sjeklocha is the one who came from Yugoslavia in this country in 1964. Brenneke is from Portland, Oregon. And they teamed up, and the weapons were sent from Czechoslovakia to Yugoslavia, the home base where Sjeklocha came from. Now, William Clark, when he came to this country after World War II, brought his wife, who was a Czechoslovakian. He also was responsible for bringing Helene von Damme, a woman from Austria, into this country. And I'm sure, as I refer to the information I learned from those many Philby books, that the contacts in Czechoslovakia and in Yugoslavia go back to Paul Sjeklocha, or the wife of William Clark in Czechoslovakia, and the contacts that were continuing. It'd be hard to believe that the communist government was sending weapons to kill communists in Central America. The weapon purchases of $20 million worth of weapons that went from Czechoslovakia to Yugoslavia and then made a route to Bolivia and then to Panama, where Noriega got a hunk of it, and the cocaine kings contributed a good hunk of this money, the Medellin cartel, and sent the planes back to the United States with the narcotics on them so that the weapons could be sold, sending the planes down, and shipments of weapons could be sold and transferred from around the world to Honduras, and then the planes would come back to the United States empty, where the cocaine and narcotics would be put on, and Medellin cartel could unload their cocaine and narcotics in the United States. Mr. Brenneke, in sworn deposition to Kerry subcommittee, said how the weapons moved, and this is the route he gave, and how they were flown to Panama, and Noriega got a hunk of the money. Then they were flown to northern Costa Rica and El Salvador to be delivered to the Contras. Now, this sounds very complicated to send weapons, this many weapons, $20 million, and then more probably besides, from Czechoslovakia to Yugoslavia to Bolivia to Panama to northern Costa Rica to El Salvador, and then to the Contras. And can you believe that this many people were involved in all this with Interpol and all the persons at docks, at airports that should have information? And we have over 500 members of Congress, and none of them ever figured out what was going on. Richard Brenneke said that the same planes that shipped arms to the Contras were then used to fly cocaine from Colombia back up to Panama into the United States, arranged by the Medellin cocaine cartel. They sent the money for the weapons, and the weapons were purchased, and they originally were supplied, the seed money, by the Medellin cartel. The money was put up, and then once the operation was going, it flowed the weapons and drugs, weapons to the Contras, drugs back to the United States, and everybody was happy. Several key persons in the Iran-Contra scandal, including the top aides to George Bush, were major role in the arms supermarket. This all is in Newsweek this week. I don't have to go into too much detail. Donald Gregg, the aide of George Bush, was the principal contact in Washington. He worked with the National Security Council, advised the vice president, and the Mossad had recruited Brenneke in 1983. That was a key year of shifting plans in the National Security Council and the government, and the Mossad station chief in Guatemala provided Brenneke with Donald Gregg's phone number at the White House, and then they began, the Mossad and the White House were calling Mr. Gregg, Mossad, the drug dealers and the arms dealers were calling the White House to Donald Gregg, and they had his home phone number too. And November 3rd, 1983, Brenneke called Mr. Gregg to make sure that this was all authorized, that this was kosher. After all, he was working with the Mossad, and he assured him it was kosher, and by mid-1985, he was concerned about the links of weapons and narcotics trafficking, and he got into the operation, and he quit in 1985. His last flight was into Amarillo, Texas. The plane he came on was filled with narcotics, and he said, "I've had enough." And he called the White House, and he called Donald Gregg and told him of the drug links, and Gregg told him, "Don't question the decision of your betters." And there was a quotation on the TV yesterday where he literally told him to butt off and shut up, and Gregg is denying the conversations. This Del Amico, a man who had been recruited as the Honduran contact in 1965, was a long friend of CIA partner Felix Rodriguez, and Rodriguez started working for Ollie North in the National Security Council, and he became manager of Contra Air with the resupply base in El Salvador. Regarding the arms for the Contras, Del Amico hired for his Honduran contacts Felix Rodriguez of the CIA, and the link between Donald Gregg and Gomez Rodriguez into Washington, frequent trips has been charted out, and to personally visit with George Bush, and George Bush to this day acts as if he's a little stupid. Now, Mario was a former CIA officer, and he was the one who brought in the Honduran military officers into the arms supermarket, Del Amico, and he was the contact between Honduras operations and Felix Rodriguez of the CIA. Felix worked with Donald Gregg in Vietnam. He was an aide to George Bush, and a lot of this team, Chichi Quintera and a lot of the drug dealers, of course, were all part of operations in Laos and in Vietnam, and a lot of this has been detailed in the Christic Institute, but now it's finally moving to the front pages of our newspapers and into the television news, and it's getting a lot of coverage, and it's about time. The phone logs from Gomez and Rodriguez to Gregg are listed in a lot of publications. I think you'll be able to see them. I have the dates if you want them. They were frequently in contact, and there has to be no other reason except that the vice president had a person working under him who was under him in the CIA, Donald Gregg, and George Bush was CIA director, remember, at one time, and George Bush worked with these very people in operations when he was the CIA director that were now pushing the drug traffic and the weapons in Central America. And it's going to be very hard for George Bush to wipe his slate clean. Starting as soon as Hossman was landed, there were excellent newspaper articles on the connections of these various people. And I think, while their names were all new to us then, they're getting more clear now. The New York Times, February the 2nd, 1987, has a long article on the Demiben project from the United States to Iran. And a lot of this overlaps with the work that Barbara Honninger's done about arms that were sent to Iran by way of the United States in the early 1980s. It was called the Demiven Project. And the people involved with that were Lieutenant Colonel George Alvarez, chief of the Marine Corps Counterintelligence, who worked with Mr. Brenneke on illegal arms to Iran. And remember, now Brenneke's involved with the arms to the Contras and that network down there that were into the drug traffic. And Paul Cutter, former CIA analyst, whose name is also Paul Sjeklocha, the one from Yugoslavia. Colonel Brian Hooton, Air Force officer, Pentagon advisor for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who met with Brenneke to discuss arms deals for Iran. And this article from the New York Times lists the various people that worked with Brenneke, such as Robert McFarland, Vice Admiral John Poindexter, Major General John Singlaub, and General Secord, and so forth. And there are a lot of people from France, French arms dealers, that tie up to Glenn Suham, the gentleman who was murdered and was involved in the shipment of arms to Iran, and then a shipment that went down to Central America. So the one satisfying thing about all of this team is that the names keep reappearing. They use the same names over and over, which is useful because the secret team is certainly a small team. The San Jose Mercury had a story August 9th, 1985, alleged smugglers' Israeli dealings, and it's about Paul Sjeklocha, otherwise known as Paul Cutter, the man that worked with Mr. Brenneke in that group. Sjeklocha visited Israel as a journalist and was a member of the Jewish Institute of National Security, known as JINSA, J-I-N-S-A. And I mentioned the JINSA organization on several broadcasts. They were a group to study, they are a group to study anti-terrorism. There's 12,000 members of this nonprofit organization that was formed in 1976. And I believe they are the agent provocateurs that actually stir terrorism as an excuse for them to get a bigger foothold into each country to control the police and the news, and that their counterterrorism is not to stop terrorism. An example is Israel. It's one of the biggest terrorists in the United States, the second biggest, or twist them around. And JINSA is an organization that includes people like Paul Cutter, Paul Sjeklocha, and Michael Ledeen, and of course it involves George Bush, who was at the meetings, and the high-ups in American intelligence. And the terrorism continues, and we keep blaming certain persons, while I think most of the major terrorism stories have been agent provocateur right from the beginning. I referred earlier to that article in Progressive magazine. There won't be time to cover all of it, but this came out in May 1987 and is pertinent to what is in the news now, but this came out 1 year earlier, written by Alan Nairn. And it's a long article about the connections of George Bush's office and the people he worked with, those agents that he had working in Central America, and the ties to the arms shipments at a time when Congress had the Bolin Amendment and the United States was supposed to butt out of assisting the Contras in trying to overthrow the government in Nicaragua. And when Congress voted one way, the White House decided they would do it their way. And that, of course, is the danger of the National Security Council that I've talked about for so many years, that Congress really isn't worth a bean because they not only do it, but they get away with it. The special prosecutor isn't even going into these problems. But those items are so much in the news, I just wanted to update a little bit and talk about them. And then next week, I do want to get back to INSLAW. Before I leave it, no matter what's in the news, I think we should do more on that because that will be a continuing case also. So this is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week. And it's certainly interesting to follow the papers and television. So just keep up with it if you can. There is so much coming out.